Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly important webinar discussion on the Gaza Strip. This discussion will happen in English, but we have simultaneous Arabic translation available through the Arabic channel on Zoom. For those who want to listen to the translation, kindly mute the original audio in order to give a clear Arabic audio. الترجمة إلى اللغة العربية متوفرة عبر زوم. أرجى اختيار القناة العربية وmute original, please. My name is Omar Rahman. I'm a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, an independent think tank based in Doha. Although we have a long legacy, the Middle East Council is a new institution, and this is our inaugural event. So we're excited to have you with us. I feel very fortunate to have an extremely insightful and articulate group of speakers joining us today as well. So let me start by introducing them. First, we have Omar Shakir. Omar is a human rights lawyer who has been the Human Rights Watch Director for Israel and Palestine for the past 6 years. And he has really headed some groundbreaking work in that time, so much so that Israel actually expelled Omar from the country in 2019 as part of what's clearly, given what we've seen over the past few weeks, an expanding effort to silence human rights defenders that are documenting what is happening there. We also have Dr. Dalal Irakat, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Arab American University in Palestine. She's also a weekly columnist for Al-Quds newspaper, and lucky for us, Dalal was most recently in Gaza in July, right before the latest attack. So she can bring her direct experience and perspective to bear on this conversation. Last, but certainly not least, we have Mohammed Shahadeh, who is the Chief of Programs and Communications at the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. Mohammed is also a prolific writer and contributor to the international media, and I highly suggest you read his work. He's one of the most unique and insightful voices around today on this issue, in my opinion. So I'm going to start by giving some brief background remarks about the situation in Gaza. Then we're going to move right into a 45-minute discussion with our guests. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A with the audience. Obviously, what prompted today's discussion on Gaza was Israel's bombardment of the Strip earlier this month, which took the lives of 49 Palestinians, including 17 children. The three-day military assault, which appeared to be unprovoked other than by Israel's own actions, really brought into sharp focus the nature of Gaza's reality, which I believe is unparalleled in the world today. And that reality is one in which a captive population of 2.2 million stateless people are being subjected to an indefinite form of collective punishment and living at the mercy of the military might of a regional superpower. Over the past 15 years, Gaza has been under a total land, sea, and air blockade. And during that time, Israel has launched 5 major military campaigns that have destroyed much of the territory's vital infrastructure, left tens of thousands homeless. Nearly 6,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed during that time, and nearly a quarter of those have been children. So through an endless cycle of kind of destruction and piecemeal reconstruction, there has been no genuine effort to address the underlying political questions that have locked Gaza in this situation. In the meantime, the blockade has been catastrophic to all aspects of life there, devastating Gaza's business and manufacturing sectors, immiserating the population, generating an ecological crisis, and cutting the territory off from the rest of Palestine and the outside world. And although the blockade was imposed after Hamas took control of the territory in 2007, the policy of isolating Gaza is much older. And we can trace that, even back to 1948 and Israel's decision to prevent refugees from returning to their homes. Around 70% of Gaza's population are refugees from Palestine, from the rest of Palestine. What we see today, though, really began in the early 1990s, at the tail end of the First Intifada, when Israel began imposing a general closure on Gaza and instituting a restrictive permit system for entry to and exit to and from the Strip. And by the mid-1990s, an enclosure fence was built around Gaza, and after the Second Intifada, this had been replaced by a militarized wall that hermetically sealed off the territory from the rest of the country. And this is what it's often meant when Gaza is described as the world's largest open-air prison. Despite removing its settlers in 2005, Israel continues to exert effective control over Gaza, including control of its borders, its airspace, its waterways, the population registry, giving IDs, currency, the movement of people, trade, electrical supply, water supply, and more. And the only ways in and out are through the Beit Hanun or Erez crossing, which Dalal recently went through, or the Rafah crossing into Egypt, which has joined Israel in this blockade. And as a result of the siege and the longer standing policies of closure, Gaza is facing one of the world's worst humanitarian and ecological crises. 64% of the population suffers from food insecurity, with 80% relying on outside assistance. Over half the population lives in poverty. Unemployment is at 47%. 96% of the drinking water from the water aquifers is not fit for human consumption, according to World Health Organization guidelines. Gaza has one power plant for its entire population, and the fuel to operate it is severely restricted, which leaves most Gazans with few hours of power a day. There are chronic fuel, electricity, and medical supply shortages. Obviously, people with medical needs have a very difficult time leaving to receive the care they need. Students seeking a higher education outside of Gaza are routinely denied the chance to leave. So I could go on and on, obviously, but perhaps maybe the United Nations put it most starkly when they warned in 2012 that Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Obviously, we are already past that date, but the underlying message is that Gaza cannot survive indefinitely under present conditions without some sort of collapse. I want to end these remarks on a different note, because Gaza obviously has another face. It's a place of life, of hope, sunny weather, beautiful beaches, great food, dynamic culture. And everyone I've ever met that has spent time in Gaza comes away with a deep love of the place and the people. And I think that's a testament to the resilience of Gazans in the face of so much tragedy. So I'm going to turn now to our guests. Mohammed, I've given a general picture and some statistics, and I want to start this conversation by turning to you. You were born and raised in Gaza, your family's there. Can you offer us maybe a more complete picture by sharing the human dimensions? How do Palestinians in Gaza cope with this immense hardship of living in an open-air prison, and the kind of trauma of feeling like an attack could happen at any point?
Thank you so much, Omar. It's certainly a great pleasure to be on this panel with such amazing and very sharp and intelligent voices such as Dalal and Omar Shakir and yourself. I think to start with Gaza, with a summarizing line, I would say that once you're there, everything screams in your face that this is not okay, this is not a way to live. But at the same time, everything screams that this place has too many unrealized potentials or trapped potentials. So as you mentioned, you have a beautiful coastal landscape, you have 5-star and 4-star hotels and resorts, spas, etc. Gaza has super delicious cuisine. A Gazan knafa is way better than the Nabulsi knafa, of course. And you have grilled fish at Al Dira that some people whom I know, Europeans who've been to Gaza, said that they've never tasted anything like that. I can attest with confidence. On the other hand, I would start with the positive indicators. You have a very, very, very pragmatic population that is yearning and longing to engagement, to dialogue, to establishing a breakthrough, that is very skeptical towards violence, destruction, war, escalations, etc. But so that is represented, for example, in statistics that Dr. Khalil Shaqaqi conducts regularly, in which he finds that people in Gaza tend to be more in favor of engaging in, let's say, a peace process or a negotiation or a diplomatic process than people in the West Bank or in Israel. And people in Gaza tend to believe in the value of engagement and the value of dialogue. And on the other hand, people in Gaza, they don't think about in terms of what they like. So let's say the paradigm of one state or two states, they think about what works, not what feels good. So in that sense, if you ask anybody there, they would say, okay, one state's 2, 3, 4 fried chicken, as long as it allows you a dignified life free of humiliation and subjugation, as long as it allows you to afford the very basics that we take for granted in our everyday lives, to be able to find a job, to fall in love, to travel in and out, then they would be in favor of that solution. You also have a very, very highly educated population with a strong entrepreneurial spirit within the harsh limitations imposed on them. So there's a community in Gaza that's called Gaza Sky Geeks, if you can look that up, in which it's growing exponentially in terms of training and empowering young people to work with software, programming, etc., and make a living out of it, and try to challenge the physical inaccessibility to Gaza and break to the other side virtually through the internet. We have other initiatives. We Are Not Numbers, for example, of about 200 young people who are very gifted and talented in advocacy and storytelling and amplifying their narrative. And you could go on and on and on extemporaneously on countless examples of entrepreneurial initiatives in Gaza. There's this sort of undefeated spirit of keep trying. On the other hand, with the grim side of the equation, of course, everybody is familiar with the destruction, the immiseration, impoverishment, all of it together. But I think the two worst aspects of it is, the intuitive one is the entrapment of Gaza, being caged in this place, not being able to escape, but also not being able to have people from abroad come and see what's happening. The total inaccessibility, the isolation, that is very, very despairing and dispiriting. On the other hand, the other issue that is way more painful, I would say the most painful, is the slow passage, painful slow passage of time. You have people who've reached the age of 33 without having ever voted a single time in their lives, without almost having ever gotten a job. I know many people, loved ones, friends, etc., reach the age of 35 without being able to fall in love, to start a family. And some say very clearly that I'm very terrified of the idea of dying before I even experience living. So that's the other side of the equation. And it leaves the population with, like, no matter how hard you try, there's a cage at every turn. There's a wall wherever you look. Things will take you down in any way you try. And that has to do with the regular expectation that a war will happen. It has to do with living every day with Israeli drones on top of your head. The intensity increases not when Israel has, let's say, a substantial operational activity happening, but it increases when Israel wants to send a message to the population and their de facto rulers. So in times of Israel trying to send a message of warning to, let's say, Hamas or the Islamic Jihad, the intensity of drones increase on top of your head insanely. So the trauma is always there. The restrictions in place are also extremely ridiculous and unimaginable. So a few months ago, Israel announced that one of the easing measures of the blockade was allowing in certain IT equipment that was previously restricted. If you take a look at the list, and I can provide the whole list, I think it was 52 items, if I remember correctly. Some of the items, they are absolutely ridiculous. So you have money counting machines that was previously restricted, because God forbid if Gazans have one of those, they might improve arithmetics or whatever. We have ATM machines were previously restricted. Computers of certain kinds, etc. With mobile telephone signals until today, it's not allowed for Gaza to have a 3G or 4G or whatever G that comes after that. It remains a 2G. So there is a wall and a barrier at every turn. Lastly, the options that this leaves the people with: a constant sense of threat, drones on top of your head every day, threats from Israeli leaders every minute as part of electoral campaigns, etc. The constant claustrophobia of entrampment, and the constant excruciating familiarity with a painful, slow passage of time. You're just getting older and older and older, and nothing is changing. It doesn't seem that it will ever come to an end. Like, one of the things that I feel sometimes guilty to do is to write one of my friends in Gaza to say, happy birthday, you just turned 35. Because that, you don't know if that will be received as a positive message or a reminder that they're running out of time without having experienced life. And that leaves the population with very grim choices, one of which is, of course, to escape to a world that is increasingly hostile towards migrants and refugees, with this extreme intolerance. So that window is closing down. Another one is to apply for permits to work in Israel, but that Israel currently allows about 14,000 to 15,000 people maximum, and that is super, super restricted, with so many hurdles and blocks on the road. And then there's the option that is most painful to even think about, which is trying to take your own life. So you have a population that is deeply religious, very culturally conservative, with a common belief that taking your own life, suicide, is a gateway to eternity in hell. And yet every week you would hear stories about young people who were compelled by the ugliness and the entrampment of life there to believe that God's hell, no matter how frightening it is, will be better than the hell that Gaza has been made into. The last thing is disillusionment. So you have a population that literally tried everything. And now when you talk to people, they just increasingly develop a belief that nothing works, nothing is rewarded. The international community says you have to try nonviolence. Okay, Gaza tried the Great March of Return, overwhelmingly nonviolent by the accounts of both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And Israel's reaction to that was crushing it completely. The international community's reaction to that was confined to whether or not the level of violence that Israel deployed has been proportional. But the message of the protest, what people were trying to say, is entirely almost ignored. Violence that 4 or 5 times, not with major escalations, nothing coming out of it. Democratic reform, we tried that. Israel prevented elections in Jerusalem. It all collapsed down and fell apart. So you have a population that literally says that what is the way? If we are willing to try anything that would work. And in that situation, what you have in Gaza is not a stagnant or an ideological belief in, let's say, violence versus non-violence, democracy versus tyranny, or any of these dichotomies or binaries. It's rather very experimental. People are willing to try anything that would lead to a result. And when you have Gaza providing what Israel is asking for, what the international community is asking for, providing complete quiet, maintaining silence, maintaining complete restraint for months and months and months and months. And then on the Israeli side, that silence, that calm is totally unrewarded. It ends up increasing the prominence and highlighting fringe elements of society that see armed resistance as a language that Israel responds to, and that sees armed resistance as 2 things. As number one, deterrence. So when Gaza is providing calm, nothing's happening in Gaza, and then Israel goes on, kills Shireen Abu Akleh, then goes into Jenin almost on a daily basis, then you have 1 person killed every other day. That's when believers or advocates of armed resistance would gain prominence and raised to the forefront by saying that armed resistance is a deterrent to stop these incursions in Jenin, in Nablus, in Ramallah, the Jerusalem provocations in Al-Aqsa Mosque. But yes, also,
I think that's true. I think we're going to move into that as well later on in the conversation. So thank you, Mohammed. It's really, honestly, you offered very textured and comprehensive look. I mean, we used to talk about the generations of Palestinians who have known nothing but occupation, or the generation of Oslo. But if you're 18 today in Gaza, your entire living memory has been under this siege and constant bombardment. And the way people internalize that and the lack of options, I think you've done a fantastic job of expressing what that is. I don't know if I can follow your statement of the kanafa being better in Gaza, but I'll take your word for it, as I've never eaten it there, only in Nablus. Dalal, let's turn to you. We will, I think, take a deeper look at Israeli policy toward Gaza later on in the discussion. But for now, we can say that I think a huge part of Israeli policy towards Palestinians in general, and Gaza in particular, has been the ongoing effort to fragment politically and geographically, to divide and conquer, if you will. Can you describe how effective this has been in shaping Gaza's political reality and the evolving relationship to the rest of Palestine, and how Gaza fits politically into that larger Palestinian political context? I know that's kind of a big abstract question, but you can take it where you will.
Thank you very much, Omar. Again, I'm really happy to be part of this panel with amazing speakers, and dealing with Gaza, which is something that is very dear to my brains and to my heart. Coming out of Gaza just a couple of weeks ago, I can share with the world that.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Sorry.
Sure.
We've just been asked to just kind of talk more slowly so our interpreters in Arabic have a chance to catch up, because we all tend to speak fast.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
So I just wanted to share that when you visit Gaza, you can leave Gaza, but Gaza will never leave you. That's how I feel, and I wanted to share this with the audience and with whoever is gonna see this video, because I think Gaza is a place that is very worthy of visiting, of considering to visit. It has a lot to give and to offer. It has an amazing bright side, despite all the odds, despite all the poverty, the sufferings, the tragedies, and the news that we hear about. But Gaza has a lot to offer. But going back to your question, Omar, well, everybody hears about the siege, the blockade on Gaza. However, Israel tried to tell the world that the Israeli authorities had withdrawn from Gaza, and that Sharon withdrew and deployed around 9,000 Jewish settlers from settlements around Gaza. Well, this is part of the truth. But Israel did not share with the world that when they did disengage from Gaza, they did it unilaterally. They did not bother to even coordinate with the PLO or with the PNA in Ramallah. And I'm stressing on this fact because at that time, and I want to quote from Tariq Bakoni here, who mentioned in his latest chapter, that he told the story about Ariel Sharon talking about his aide, Dov Weisglass, when he was asked about the disengagement plan from Gaza. He literally said, what we are doing is actually a formaldehyde. So he meant exactly, they were doing what was necessary for, to leave no room for political process with the Palestinians in Gaza. So what Sharon did, he had the intention in that unilateral step to make sure that he supplies Gaza with what is enough to sustain it, but to make sure that it will be divided from the West Bank, leading to the reality that we are living today. So some might argue that, for example, the Palestinians are not capable of ruling themselves in unity. Yes, this is a setback that we have to face and that we have to deal with in our internal politics, but nobody can deny the fact that Sharon at that time and the Israeli authorities continue to maintain the status quo in Gaza. They are the ones who empowered and maintained the status quo in Gaza. And let me specify a little bit more. What Israel had managed to do is basically empower Hamas in Gaza. And allow me to share with the audience that when Hamas appeared, Hamas had an ideology which was very contrary to diplomacy, for example. Hamas's charter proclaimed jihad for the liberation of Palestine, for example. They did not opt for diplomatic tools. However, today, if we follow closely what is happening in Gaza or the different negotiations that are taking place, one can easily tell that Hamas is not very different than Fatah today when it comes to the tools and the approaches in dealing with the situation. So Israel had managed and had succeeded in presenting Gaza today as the fig leaf, as because Hamas is there, and because unfortunately Gaza is labeled with terror today. Whether we like it or not, this is a fact that we have to face as Palestinians when it comes to dealing with the question of Gaza and how do we move it forward. Hamas is the scarecrow that Israel is using to justify whatever security reasons they want for their own colonial settler system. My message, when we do the diagnosis on the bigger scene of the division between the West Bank, East Jerusalem on one hand, and the Gaza Strip on the other hand, that we need to be reminded, and we need to remind the world, that Gaza remains part of Palestine. Palestinians are obliged to come together, to reconcile, to unite, and to remember that we cannot have a state without Gaza. And we cannot have a state in Gaza as well. Coming out of Gaza, I will not hide that I did witness how people feel totally abandoned, and how people feel that they are totally isolated, and that they are far away from the West Bankers, even let alone the Westerns or the foreigners or the tourists. They do feel a bit hopeless in reconciliation efforts, because they had witnessed a lot of rounds which did not bear any fruits. So it is crucial that we deal with Gaza as part of Palestine, and as a national Palestinian strategy. I think it is very wise and it is very timely for us to remember that the economic power, the economic weight for Palestinians really lies in Gaza. So when we speak about Palestinian state, for example, sovereignty or statehood, or our national aspirations in statehood, we should not, and we cannot imagine that state, independent or economically sovereign without Gaza. It is very important to highlight that the blockade is basically translating what we call structural violence and collective punishment. People are facing a totally unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So when we witness the loss of hope, or the despair, or the suffering, or the negativity, those are not to blame. However, when you go to Gaza, you also see a lot of positive side, a lot of creativity, and a lot of hope at the same time. I mean, the scenery is very dialectic. You see all different kinds of positive and negative at the same place. But despite the scarcity of no electricity, no water, no basic human needs available to the 2.2 million Palestinians who are living in Gaza, we should realize that Israel is dealing with the Palestinians in general as a whole, and with Gaza specifically, under the thoughts and the approach of the shrinking the conflict approach, where they only want to supply the Palestinians, and more specifically the Gazans, with the minimum of what makes our lives livable, what would sustain our bodies to maybe breathe, but not more than that. I think shrinking the conflict deals with the Palestinians on something that resonates with the international community approach today with Gaza, which comes under the umbrella of the humanitarian aid. With all the respect to the aid that is coming to Gaza, with all the respect to the projects and to the tens of thousands of dollars or euros that are being pledged to rebuild Gaza, I don't think dealing with Gaza on a humanitarian base is enough. Gaza is a political issue, and there is a siege, a blockade on Gaza. And I think we need a macro approach today to be adopted in dealing with the Gaza. I mean, the international community, with all the gratitude coming from the Gazans and the Palestinians to whatever they do in helping the Palestinians in Gaza survive. But I think a more political approach and policy needs to be adopted in dealing with the Gaza question.
Yes, I think we're going to get into the international question. I mean, you mentioned something that's interesting about empowering Hamas and making it into a scarecrow. It reminded me during the Great March of Return, the defense minister at the time in Israel was Avigdor Lieberman, and he was talking on, I think, Israeli radio, military radio, and he said, you have to, in response to questions about, the use of lethal force against unarmed protesters, he said, you have to understand there are no innocent people in the Gaza Strip. Everyone has a connection to Hamas. So just living under Hamas de facto rule makes you a legitimate target for violence. And at the same time, it seems like Israel uses, again, Hamas as the word every time, in the same way security is used or terrorism is used to kind of scuttle any effort to address the underlying political problems that you mentioned, which are at the heart of the situation. And I think
at the same time, Omar, it was Netanyahu himself who admitted that he, facilitated the cash money from Ben Gurion to Gaza. This is a fact that should not be hidden anymore. But
I mean, what I wanted to really target into was, that's the Israeli policy, but there's also, the division between Fatah and Hamas has gone on for a very long time. So it seems like there's the Palestinians themselves are feeding into this fragmentation effort, or helping Israel in a sense, by remaining fragmented and not addressing their issues together. I mean, can you talk about a little, just very briefly, how the Palestinian political fragmentation internally is helping shape the reality in Gaza?
Thank you, Omar. Well, I wouldn't say that the Palestinians are intentionally helping the Israelis in implementing their strategy and their divide and rule strategy against the Palestinians. Because as you just mentioned, every Palestinian is target to the Israeli military occupation. No matter if you're a West Banker, Jerusalemite, Gazan, we're all targets. Shireen Abu Akleh, the fine Christian American Palestinian journalist, my cousin who was 26 years old, athlete in a love affair. Every Palestinian is target to this Israeli occupation. However, the durability of the ongoing division that is taking place between the West Bank and Gaza, yes, it stands out as a main obstacle that we need to face as Palestinians. It is about time that we question our setbacks internally. And I think it is very wise for us to realize that we have been giving an excuse to the international community, to Israel, to justify, not putting any effort or progress into granting us our political rights, because we are giving them that excuse. It is about time we realize whether it is intentional or unintentional, but it's about time that those in Gaza and those who represent the PNA in Ramallah and elsewhere realize that Gaza is part of Palestine, and that the best interests of the Palestinian national aspirations cannot be fulfilled without the unity between Gaza and the West Bank. And here, I might suggest that it is also time to maybe reshape.
Are you saying those in Ramallah are no longer thinking of Gaza as part of Palestine or the future?
I think it is time we realized that Gaza must be part of Palestine, that we should not be treating Gaza as a separate entity. We should not be treating Gaza as, as an isolated strip in the south. We should look at Gaza as our economic power. We should look at the shores of Gaza. We should remember that we have gas fields on the coast of Gaza. We should remember our natural resources in Gaza. And we should remember that when we first, when the PLO first started its peace talks with the Israelis, fulfilling the two states approach of the international community, it was based on a one territorial unit bringing together the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And it's time that we act upon that. I know that they are still adopting the same rhetoric and they might say the same things, but it's about time we act. It's about time that we see that the leadership, and I'm not only speaking about the PLO leadership, but also the Hamas leadership. It's not enough to lip service the Palestinians. The Palestinian youth, and I teach in the university, I teach conflict resolution and I teach diplomacy. And I usually survey among my students and the master's students as well. We do feel that there is no role for the youth in playing any, political role in reconciling, for example. So it might be wise to include more youth, to include more women, to reshape those who represent the PNA on this side or Hamas on that side. As long as we are oriented towards our national collective aspirations, I think that is our only way out. As long as we only care about sustaining what we have in the West Bank and sustaining what we have in Gaza, and we continue to look at the Palestinian question from a humanitarian perspective, I don't think we will get anything in regards with our, national aspirations besides some service to our some basic needs here and there, some permits here or some rights here and there, which are all shattered with the continued, Israeli policies on daily basis of confiscation of lands, of settler colonialism, of the administrative detention. We have 723 Palestinians who are administratively detained. Administrative detention doesn't happen but in Israel. It's about time we hold Israel accountable and we come united, we come bold.
We're gonna get to that question about how to move past this. So let me move on because we'll never get through all our questions at this rate. Omar, I wanted to bring you in and to start looking more directly at Israeli policy towards Gaza, although it's been discussed. I mean, you recently published an article with the headline, "Cage, Smother, Subdue, Repeat, Israel's Gaza Policy." Can you tell us what this policy involves? What is Israel's objective? And maybe describe the lens through which Israel views Gaza and how that justifies, its collective punishment of the Strip.
Thanks, Omar, and really just to echo my thanks to the Middle East Council on Global Affairs for hosting this really important discussion. Too often, Gaza is not as central to a discussion of Israel-Palestine in these kinds of forums. So I think it's refreshing to see this focus and really an honor to be with Mohammed and Dalal, who really said it all. Let me sort of go through that article a little bit. So when we say cage, and again, this has been alluded to by Mohammed, Israel since 2007 has imposed a generalized closure on the Gaza Strip. So what this policy means is that there is a generalized travel ban. So the 2.1 plus million Palestinians of Gaza cannot leave, presumptively, unless they fit within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions, right? So just to understand that policy, that means somebody maybe can get a permit to, let's say they need a life-saving procedure. But the next week, if they want a permit because they have an art exhibit in Ramallah, I'm not even talking about abroad, within Palestine, or because they want to go on vacation, they can't do so. And that's been a policy that's been in place. It's not based on individualized security assessment. So it is a policy of caging outside of narrow humanitarian exemptions. And it's not only the movement of people, right? It's also, and that's subdue. It also applies to the movement of goods. Sorry, that's the smother part of it, to the movement of goods. So you have these widespread restrictions on entry and exit of goods. A lot of people have focused on the limitations of goods that can come in, which is an important part of the analysis. But what's equally, maybe even more important, is the way in which Israel micromanages the economy of Gaza, right? So what produce can go to the West Bank, what vegetables, there's a list of what's permitted to go out. And this is really at the heart of crippling the economy of Gaza, leading to the reality that you laid out very, very eloquently, Omar, of the economic situation, where you have GDP per capita that is 20+% lower than it was in the early 1990s, and all the other indicators you mentioned. It also leads to the reality where the majority of families in Gaza spend the majority of their day without electricity. And it's not only what you said, Omar, about the power plant, it's also that Israel could tomorrow provide 24 hours of electricity to Gaza, as it does to the Israeli communities that are right on the border. It's been controlling Gaza for 55 years, but it chooses not to do so. So the next part of it is subdue. And again, Omar, you mentioned in your opening remarks that we've had these never-ending cycles of escalations. And in each case, we have documented unlawful Israeli airstrikes and war crimes, including strikes that wipe out entire families, that knock down residential buildings, some of the most prominent towers in Gaza, with no apparent military target in mind, strikes that deliberately target civilian infrastructure, that are disproportionate, that are excessive, that are unlawful, and all of this. And of course, it comes down to the basic reality of Israel dropping highly explosive weapons with wide area effects in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, an open air prison. So then you get to the repeat part, which is despite serious violations of international law, we repeat the same cycle, right? Where you get a ceasefire. Gaza, and Mohammed put it very well, fades from the headline. People continue to live under this closure policy, and you go through the cycle one more time. And we've now been in this situation for 15 plus years, and clearly, and by the way, I should add, beyond just the caging of people in Gaza to the external world, there's a policy of separation, a formal policy of separation between Gaza and the West Bank. That's critical to note. Israel and Oslo recognized Gaza and the West Bank as constituting one territory. So does the entire international community. And to me, Ahmad, you asked about collective punishment. Undoubtedly, that's a part of the Israeli policy. But actually, in some ways, that's almost too generous, because we're almost saying, well, they're punishing all the people of Gaza for, the fact that Hamas has risen to power. But the actual motivations behind Israel's policy to Gaza, and we analyze this in depth in our 2021 April report, A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. The Gaza policy at core is about demographic reengineering. It's about caging 2.1 million Palestinians in a 25 by 7 mile, 40 by 11 kilometer strip of land. So they're in essence off the demographic books, allowing Israel to consolidate in their calculation a Jewish majority across Israel and the West Bank, which it hopes to retain. This isn't some, a conspiracy theory. It's actually documented in the statements of Israeli government officials. And if you study their implementation of their policy, court rulings, etc., so it's actually part, in many ways, as awful as the reality in Gaza is not the exception, right? Gaza is the policy model for what we see in areas A, B, and C, squeezing of Palestinian communities into dense population enclaves, maximizing Jews, minimizing Palestinians, maximum land for Jewish Israelis, minimum Palestinians, and that underlies that's a policy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and underlies Israel's crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. The closure policy, this Israel policy, is a part of that larger policy. Don't forget that 70+% of Gaza's population are refugees that were forced out of their homes, forced to flee or expelled in 1947. So you have 70+ years of denying their right to return, 55 years of abusive occupation, 15 years of closure, living under apartheid, all that come together in the reality we see today.
Yes, thank you for that. I was going to ask you about the report that you guys published, Human Rights Watch, on the crime of apartheid. And I think you did a good job kind of explaining that. I mean, I know, for example, that roughly 30% of the population, the Palestinian population that lives under Israeli control, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, are in Gaza and confined to 1.4% of historic Palestine. So you can see that as part of this effort to kind of, take maximum land with minimum people, and on the other side, put under Palestinian control, so to speak, the maximum number of Palestinians on the minimum amount of land. So this is kind of the trajectory and the policy. So, I mean, do you see Gaza then as, a precursor for the emerging Bantuization of the West Bank, to borrow a term from South Africa?
I mean, so let me answer that in a couple of ways. One is to say we already have that. In the West Bank, you have 165 Palestinian enclaves, and that's surrounded by a sea of Israeli settlements and larger control, right? These territorial islands that are there. That's been documented. And the Palestinians in the West Bank, yes, they don't face as severe of restrictions on movement as the Palestinians in Gaza, but they too, face a permit regime when it comes to entering occupied East Jerusalem, which is a part of the occupied Palestinian territory, entering Israel proper. There are hundreds of military checkpoints that turn a short commute into an hours-long ordeal, the separation barrier. So you already have the full infrastructure of Gaza in the West Bank. Now it's a choice of when Israel chooses to apply it. And now as part of a political strategy of separation otherwise, and minimizing, they have chosen to carry that out most forcefully in Gaza, but they could easily do it in the West Bank. And again, we're seeing signs that they're moving that way. On September 5th, so in a week, Israel is due to implement new entry guidelines to the West Bank that would restrict the number of foreign students at Palestinian universities, faculty that teaches at the universities. That would maybe most fundamentally affect the ability of Palestinians to live with their foreign spouses. So, fundamentally affecting family unity. So the reality here is that the Gaza policy is often treated as this exceptional reality. It's different. I mean, even the term Gazan is one that we don't use at Human Rights Watch because these are Palestinians that live in Gaza, right? So, and there's so the idea that it's somehow different, I think deprives from the reality of this being part of a single strategy that's tuned in different ways at different times to effectuate the same underlying goal of maintaining the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians in all areas where Israel exercises control.
Thank you very much. Mohammed, I want to bring you back into this conversation. You've also written extensively about Israeli policy in Gaza. Do you want to weigh in on this in terms of, how Israel views Gaza, what its policies are? I mean, you mentioned before, how intimately wrapped, I would say, Israeli domestic politics is in terms of how it treats Gaza, the way it metes out violence, maybe as a way to show a politician's toughness or burnish their security credentials. Maybe you can elaborate on that and touch on Israeli policy. I also want to get into, so try to keep it somewhat short, if you can, the kind of politics of resistance in Gaza and how they've evolved, because you've written quite a bit about that as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Omar. It's difficult to add anything after what Omar, Shakir, and Dalal have said very eloquently, especially on the policy of separation, the disengagement, Israel's motive behind that. But I think I wrote my thesis recently documenting 30 years of the blockade's history, because it started with Israel in 1991 canceling what was previously known as the general exit permit regime, in which anyone from Gaza or the West Bank can cross into the other territory or into Israel every day, except for the hours between 1 after midnight until 5 in the morning. They can cross in and out every day without needing a permit, which Israel canceled officially in 1991. Then 2 years later, they started building a barrier around Gaza before Oslo was signed, and then the PA comes in and the restrictions remain. If you take a look at the New York Times, they wrote an article back then saying that Palestinians now know that freedom has its limits. And one of the most recurring words, key words in the article, which was in the 90s after Oslo was signed, after the PA returned, after the territories were supposed to open up, one of the most recurring words was cage. Gazans were feeling trapped all the way back then in the 90s. Hamas, it added, let's say, pretext, an intuitive pretext to this paradigm, but it was never the reason for it. Hamas is, let's say, if it ceases to exist, it will never the blockade will never also end accordingly. Because for Israel, as Omar said, the blockade is about demographic engineering, but it's also about internal Israeli politics. Like no Israeli politician on the right, center, or left, not even in Meretz, would dare to show the slightest sign of genuine compassion to Gaza, because that is political suicide. The only thing Israeli politicians are destined to do is to show strength and deterrence in their language and actions towards Gaza. If anybody tries to show a different approach or suggest a different policy, they are immediately accused of, the Hebrew word for it is chnun, being softcore, that you're selling out, that you're being soft on terrorism. And that has to do with a heavy Israeli discursive securitization of Gaza all the way back from the first Intifada. And it intensified after Hamas took over because it allowed, let's say, a clear pretext for that. So you have an Israeli public that's been increasingly viewing Gaza only in terms of security, in terms of threat and risk prevention and management. But on the other hand, one of the ugliest things about Israel's cagement of Gaza is the example of if a Gazan Palestinian tries to move to the West Bank, then there's a procedure that Israel puts in place that Gisha, the Israeli organization that deals with restrictions on people's movements, have documented and called a procedure so special that it applies to no one. That's literally what they called it. And they say that between the early years of the blockade until 2017, only 5 applications were processed under this procedure for someone from Gaza to move to the West Bank, still within the occupied territories. If a Gazan is already living in the West Bank, magically, if he just drops from the sky and falls into Ramallah, then Israel has a number of regulations and procedures that view those Gazans in the West Bank as illegal aliens, subject to punishment up to 7 years in prison. If you're a Gazan married to someone from the West Bank, the chance of being able to meet up in any of the territories is virtually zero. If you have a child, the mom, let's say, lives in Ramallah, the father lives in Gaza, and that child wants to move to his mom in Ramallah, the father died in an airstrike, the child has no one. Israeli regulations state that unless there are 0 kinships of that child in Gaza, 0 relatives, they cannot move to the West Bank, to their parents, to their immediate family. So if that child has a distant grandfather or cousin, that should take care of them instead of the mother. So the policy is designed in every possible way to separate the two populations and keep Gazans entrapped. An interesting thing about it, a very visible contradiction, is if someone from the West Bank wants to move to Gaza, relocate permanently, then there are way more easing measures in that sense. Israeli authorities are way more cooperative. If you're a West Bank Palestinian who want to relocate to Gaza, because they can just dump you there and apply the same restrictions. So it's unidirectional. The other thing is the contradictions of the blockade, to touch on your question with resistance, are so ridiculous and unfathomable. So you have, for instance, it's easier in Gaza to get cash in money bags that went back then from Qatar to aid poor families, but also to aid Hamas's government civil servants. It was way easier to get that cash from Israel in cartoon money bags with $signs on the side than it is to get a CT scan machine for a hospital. So that is one issue. Another issue is that it's way easier to get a permit to go and work in Israel than it is to get a permit to go and study, work, or live, or marry in the West Bank. The other contradiction is that Hamas in recent years, Israel's relationship with it has developed substantially in a let's say, a transactional relationship. Hamas provides calm, Israel eases its blockade here and there. of course, not on a substantial level, and it's meant that way. And this relationship developed to the extent that Hamas has a policy or even a unit that's called the Field Control Unit. Its troops are authorized to shoot to kill anyone who tries to attack Israel during ceasefire times. Recently, there was an Israeli bulldozer that went inside Gaza, crossed the borders and went into the Gazan territories and was raising a strawberry farm for being in close proximity to the border, to the perimeter fence. So it was an Israeli vehicles, bulldozers and tanks. Farmers in the area have gathered to push the Israelis back. And video footage documenting the incident showed a Hamas personnel pushing those farmers away from the Israelis. But nonetheless, no matter how, let's say, how substantial this transactional relationship is, no matter how much restraint is shown by Gazans, Israel can never ease its blockade on Gaza on its own terms or out of its own will, out of its own initiative. Every Israeli politician on the right and left have made statements acknowledging that the situation in Gaza is uniquely ugly. The Israeli military establishment, the defense ministry have been warning repeatedly that, for instance, Gaza's health sector is on the verge of collapse. We should ease the blockade there. And you have the leadership on top saying that the situation is unsustainable. Yeah. But when it comes to action, you have statements, as you mentioned, by Avigdor Lieberman, not just the one about no innocence in Gaza. He makes another very summative statement of the situation there. He says, our policy is clear. We keep Gazans' head above the waters, their body is drowned, nothing more. Then you have Benny Gantz, who's supposed to be more towards the left, saying that, quote unquote, we will not allow real development in Gaza. Literally what he said, we will not allow real development in Gaza. Then he puts two conditions: unless Hamas establishes permanent calm and releases our boys, etc., etc. And then he says, we're not savages, we're not like them. We will allow them to eat and drink, but we will not allow real development in Gaza.
Yeah.
So you have a conscious.
I was going to say, it's very interesting. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about, and you're touching on that, is the way kind of decades of dehumanization interacts with this campaign politics in Israel. And then, it's the same thing for the two-state solution. You've gone so far down this path that any effort to resolve political issues, gets attacked by the other side and nobody can make any moves. So you're just so far down the line that nothing can be resolved in this particular manner. I think, so we have about 15 minutes left. I had a number of questions that I really wanted to touch on. I wanted to ask Dalal about the regional situation and Omar about the ICC and the international response to what's happening in Gaza. I'm looking at the questions from the Q&A, and they actually are all really on the same question that people want to know. It's on people's minds. It's actually dovetails with my final question. And maybe we can incorporate some of the outstanding questions that I wanted to have. And people basically just want to know, how do we get out of this situation? You know what I mean? Is there a way out of this? I called in the headline of this, Gaza's nightmare, but a nightmare you can wake up out of. There's no end in sight to the siege. And Omar, Mohammed, you just said that there's no plans whatsoever from Israeli politicians from the top down of resolving this situation or of ending this. So how do Gazans, Palestinians, I'll refrain from using the term Gaza and Omar, how do Palestinians challenge this, and how does the international community or interested parties challenge this impunity, this system and this blockade of the Gaza Strip, and put the political questions on the table for resolution? I mean, how do we get there? And we can bring in the International Criminal Court, Omar, if you can, just to kind of discuss where it is in this process and the international response, because that's a question I wanted to direct towards you. And maybe, Dalal, you can bring in the regional countries. Obviously, Egypt plays a hand. Omar mentioned, or Mohammed mentioned the bags of money that are coming in, the humanitarian assistance from Qatar. Qatar is obviously playing a greater role in Gaza today. So maybe we can try to bring these efforts. I want all of you to discuss this in terms of how do we get out of this situation, if you can. So let's start with, I think the person that's spoken the least, maybe is Dalal. Dalal, do you mind? You want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you very much, Omar, again. Well, it's very important to look into the regional actors and the roles being played by Egypt, for example, when you go to Gaza, because I did go to Gaza also in June 2021, right after the war in May. And I mean, it is obvious, and we do have all the gratitude to Egypt for their efforts in, trying to move the rebel and, the dust, and, they did a lot of effort in cleaning Gaza after the war. And if you look at the Qatar approach in helping the people in Gaza and, the cash money that they support the families with, or the different projects, it's all very, very important. But again, as I said, it all falls under the umbrella of looking into Gaza from a humanitarian perspective. So all the efforts to deal with Gaza from a humanitarian perspective, unfortunately, provide cover, unintentionally, of course, for the continued Israeli occupation when it comes to the terms of the blockade and the siege. So, and allow me to also mention even the economic commitment coming from resource UNRWA, the different international member states that also pledge a lot of money into the UNRWA. I'm not saying that I'm advocating for refraining from that, no, but the continued economic support and the continued focus on the financial support and treating Gaza from such an angle is really shielding the Israeli occupation crimes. And I think it's about time we look at it again from a macro perspective. We look at the core issue and stop, dealing with the scarecrow that exists, in Gaza, as Israel says, but to deal with the Gaza question from the perspective of the occupation. So if we start by ending the Israeli occupation and lifting the blockade and the siege of Gaza, then I think this can be a strategy or a way out of the current installment. However, I'm sure that...
Sorry, I think we have some feedback. Do you hear that as well?
Yes.
Is that coming from the translator? Sorry.
Yes.
Translation, please. Sorry, you guys are interrupting slightly. Sorry, Dalal, go ahead.
Yeah, so if we look at the blockade, the 2.2 million people, 90% of them are refugees. Everybody knows. Everybody knows that Gaza is facing unprecedented, situation, a humanitarian crisis, which doesn't tell much about a positive future in Gaza. Loss of hope can prevail, as many UN leaders had said and uttered before. But at the same time, the suffering is happening in silence. All we see is basically statements, condemnations, or tweets coming from the international member states of the UN, or some money or projects by the IMF or the World Bank or the EU or the UN or the US. But I think this, the budget support is good, to support solar energy projects or electricity or securing water supplies, for example. Yes, those are very important things. However, in today's world, we need to draw a fine line between what we identify as human needs and what is about universal human rights. When we talk about internet, 5G, for example, or electricity or water, those are supposed to be dealt with like a human need. It's not supposed to be subjected to negotiations. Not with the Israelis.
Let me stop you and push back slightly, just to kind of target your answer. But we have to keep this very short because we're going. You're describing almost a catch-22 in which there's a humanitarian need, and Israel will allow an element of that, obviously, to keep heads above water, but is unwilling to countenance addressing the political situation or ending the blockade itself. How do you challenge that? what is a way to end this situation? I mean, if you can, as briefly as possible, so Omar and Mohammed have a chance to answer.
Yeah, I'll take it from three angles. The Palestinian angle, it's about time that we deal with Gaza as part of Palestine, and that we come together, we unite, we reconcile, because this is the only way. Unless we deal with our internal setbacks, I don't think we're going to have a promising future. From the international and the regional angle, I think it's very important for those to reconsider their approach to Gaza, because it is more humanitarian, with all the respect, but it should be dealt with from a political approach, where we start with lifting the blockade and the siege of Gaza in order to have any, prosperous futures. But also, I want to provoke the thinking here and saying that from my experience, had visited Gaza last year and this year, I have visited so many places. I've seen so many projects, and I am able to say today that I don't think the plans to reconstruct Gaza are feasible, and I don't think the plans are enough to really deal with the deep issue of Gaza vis-a-vis the Israeli occupation. I think it's about time we take a more creative, more macro, more mega maybe approach of where we have to think about more creative, strategic solutions in dealing with Gaza as maybe a mega international or regional project that should put Israel to account, to stop the blockade, to stop the siege, to grant it some freedom. I might say, in return for some guarantees from the international community. However, Gaza needs a mega project that shall look into Gaza and maybe transform it into the Saint-Tropez of the Middle East. It's about time that we, you might laugh, yes, but
no, I'm not laughing at that. I'm not laughing at that.
But honestly, when I go to Gaza, when I see the shores, and when I look at the natural resources, when I think about the exclusive economic zone that we have as Palestinians on the shore of Gaza, I think Gaza has all the elements for an amazing, successful, touristic and economic strategic project. And I think it's about time the thinking shifts towards more interest-based scenario of dealing with Gaza.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll bring you back another time to discuss the creative solutions, because I think those are indeed necessary. Omar, go ahead.
Yeah, and conscious of time, I'll just take a couple minutes so Mohammed can have the next word. But I would say from my perspective, the solutions don't need creativity, and they're not magical, right? Like, the reason why we all focus on the closure, blockade, siege, whatever word you want to use, is it's so fundamental to the realization of other rights, right? The right to movement is key to the right to work, to the right to health, to so many other, the right to family unification, all these things that are just built on that. So the first step must be, and it doesn't wait for a political solution today, right? You can't continue to have people born in Gaza without the basic right to move. Lift the closure, lift the sweeping movement restrictions in favor of a permitting free movement, subject to individualized, assessments, which is opposite of policy today. Secondly, you need, of course, to dismantle apartheid. And that's fundamental, but that needs to happen. And again, Gaza needs to be seen as part of the larger picture. In addition, you need to end impunity for grave abuses. It's clear that there is impunity, and I will say not only by the Israeli authorities, but also by the Palestinian authorities for serious abuses. That is not going to happen in Israel-Palestine. That needs to happen globally, and the International Criminal Court plays a critical role. It has a formal probe open today. It needs to move that probe forward, issue indictments, and to prosecute those who commit serious crimes, including the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution, which I'll end on just the international community. The international community falls into a cycle every time Gaza is in the news. It's in the news, people talk about it, they call for a ceasefire, maybe they issue stronger statements, but then there's a ceasefire and they forget about the underlying context, the reality of closure, of occupation, of apartheid that creates that reality. And so long as you don't deal with that, the repeat part, you're going to fall in the same pattern. So it's critical the international community pressures Israel here, seriously mentioning Gaza to lift the closure policy. And I should add again that, Egypt, plays a role in this. We've documented the way in which their restrictions on their border with Rafah contribute to the closure. We've documented the divide between Fatah and Hamas and the way in which it contributes to it. So we need this to be a focus across all areas to really ensure that we move forward. Gaza is really perpetually on the brink. We're going to have more bloodshed, heartache, unless we sort of deal with these root causes. And the core of that is apartheid, persecution, ending impunity.
Thank you. I wish we had time, because I really want to push back on that, because as you said, I mean, that isn't a creative solution. That is, the obvious thing, which is to lift the blockade, to end the apartheid and stuff like that. What I really wanted to get at with my question is, what are the practical steps you can do to get that? I mean, obviously, if you could snap your finger and end the apartheid, or get the international community to intervene, that would be one thing. But how do, it's been 15 years of a siege, and the international community hasn't really lifted a finger. How do you prompt the international, or provoke the international community to intercede here, and end the siege? Like, what are the real practical steps? I know we need to give Mohammed a chance to answer this as well, but just to get our brains working.
I'll just in 30 seconds, call reality by its name and bring to bear the human rights tools in a situation if this gravity warrants, right? Reviewing all agreements with Israel, ending those that contribute to these serious crimes, looking at arms deals, making sure you're not complicit in these underlying abuses. Those are the kind of things you need to do. Look at the playbook we use it with other situations of grave human rights abuse, apply it here.
Thank you. Hamad, wrap us up.
Sure, to be very quick.
As succinctly as possible. Yeah, thank you.
Qatar and Egypt are almost the last two countries that are giving solid attention to Gaza, despite all the flaws, imperfections, but they are the two last. I think bringing Jordan into the equation of Gaza is super important. Jordan is fixated on the West Bank, but they should be included in Gaza as well. They're almost entirely absent. It's difficult for Gazans to cross through Jordan, let alone other restrictions, etc. But as Dalal said, the aid that's coming through Qatar or Egypt or international community, the way Israel exploits it, reduces it to what people in Gaza call it painkillers or anesthetics, nothing more. It's unsustainable. The money that goes in to help poor families, let's say on a Monday, ends up in Israel on a Thursday. Because all the produce is coming through Israel. Israel is restricting Gaza's industrial potential, its potential to have commercial activities with other countries or areas, etc. So it's heavily dependent on Israel. So the aid ends up in Israel's hand eventually. With what's left as options, I say, as the late Saib Erekat would always believe, when we have disagreements, we go to the ballots, not the bullets. Elections is the only way that's left. If you look at reconciliation, everybody tried. They've been to 1 million countries, million mediators. In 2014, it collapsed because Israel withdrew from the table with the PA as soon as the PA sat down with Hamas. And Saib Erekat back then said that, well, Israel always says that we cannot talk to you and reach an agreement because you don't control Gaza. But as soon as we try to get a control of it, they say we cannot sit with you because we were in the same bed with Hamas. Mm-hmm. So reconciliation on its own is a dead end. Palestinian armed resistance has also reached the dead end that Hamas itself acknowledges. Saleh Harouri said in 2020 that although we displayed heroic examples, armed resistance has quote unquote failed in achieving a breakthrough. Non-violent resistance, unfortunately, in Gaza in specific, has not shown any tangible results. The value of nonviolence is to awaken the sleeping conscience, not only of the international community, but also of your enemy, of the occupiers. Yes. When Gazans went to the borders bare-chested, that didn't work. So that leaves us again with elections. And not as a magic pill, but as a gateway, an obligatory passage point to get our affairs in order and regain the attention of the world. The EU on its own is entirely unwilling to play any political role. The US is unlikely to pressure Israel in any meaningful way. So it again brings us back to elections as an obligatory passage point to create some sort of momentum.
I'm in total agreement. And thank you, Mohammed. It's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you to Dalal and to Omar and all the attendees that joined us today. I'm going to sign off here. Everybody have a great day. Take care, and God willing, hopefully the best for Gaza in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.